Recently, a few exciting new airlines have announced US flights, and it got me thinking, who will be the next airlines that show their face in the US? It's a different type of video on this channel, but in this video I want to look at airlines that have either made official plans to launch US flights, or airlines that would make sense to launch flights. I'm not including airlines that are adding new cities, but solely airlines that don't currently have routes to the US. I'll have timestamps for each of the airlines below, separated by continent, so go find the carrier that you want information about. A couple years ago, we tried Air Algerie on their only transatlantic service from Algiers to Montreal. The flight was a total nightmare, but it appears they've done some work to revamp the company since then. But is it enough for the North African nation of Algeria to get their flagship carrier in the US? Well, they do have the A330s that see Canadian and Chinese flights, and in 2023, to refresh the cabins and make themselves more efficient, they placed orders for 5 A330neos and 2 A350s. They scrapped the A350s, opting for 3 more A330neos, in addition to refreshing the existing A330 cabins. The concern is the demand. The US has about 50,000 Algerian Americans, mostly in the New York area, whereas Montreal, the only other transatlantic destination, has 73,000 in that metro area alone and sees 4 times weekly service. Although New York does still maintain a large tourism market amongst Algerians. The airline did previously serve JFK from 2003 to 2016, but was dropped for low demand. The aging fleet also caused passengers to fly European carriers and take a connection rather than fly with Air Algerie, so the new fleet and post-COVID travel boom may help them. The airline's director in 2024 did announce expansion plans, including Gatwick, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and New York. And since it appears that the country has their FAA Category 1 certification, which is required for a country to launch new routes, they could launch the routes once approved by the U.S. Department of Transportation, although the visa process is still difficult for either country to visit the other. TAAG Angola is another interesting one. They do have multiple 777s and 787s, and when they place their new aircraft order, they specifically mention the goal of U.S. flights. There's only about 15,000 Angolan Americans, with most of them in the Houston area, but the main draw is the oil boom that made Angola Africa's fastest growing economy, and Houston is dubbed the oil capital of the world. At the moment, there are only transatlantic flights to Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is the only Portuguese-speaking city larger than Luanda, the nation's capital. On that route, however, they are by far the cheapest option to Africa and Europe if you're okay with a layover. You'll find business class for $1,000 to Europe and less than $1,000 to Africa, which may specifically benefit the New York market, which has the highest African population that could benefit from more competition. New York to Luanda was actually found to be a majorly profitable market, and Delta looked at it but abandoned the idea for this long ago. Last month, TAG announced that they would be using their new 787s to fly from Luanda to Houston. This route has been previously served with 747s for Sun Air, which operated for 17 years for the oil industry and dubbed the Houston Express. Luanda finally opened their new airport last year, a process that took 20 years, and plans to move all services over this year. This should hopefully get them their upgraded FAA Category 1, which would allow them to launch new routes. But you'd be surprised how quickly the US moves things when they're oil motivated. The U.S. already has service from the Azores Islands, the tiny archipelago in the Atlantic, but just to the south is an independent country of roughly the same size, Cape Verde. The airline has no transatlantic flights at the moment, but did previously serve Boston and Brazil, although dropped in 2019 amid financial issues. There's actually over 100,000 Cape Verdeans in the U.S., mostly in New England, as Portugal and their former colonies have major diasporas in Boston and Northern California. Cabo Verde Airlines may not have their 757s anymore, but they do have the 737 MAX 8, which is longer range but lower capacity. Great for thin routes. This was done as they recovered from financial issues and wanted to streamline the fleet, and also involve their goals with the fleet. Other than the European destinations they serve, they're looking for 4 cities in Brazil and 2 in the US, DC and Boston. The DC move doesn't really make sense since there's really no demand, even if there are diplomatic reasons. The Boston one makes a lot of sense to me, however. Not just the Cape Verdean diaspora, but the other Portuguese-speaking diasporas in New England seeking a tropical vacation. It's a similar situation to Azores Airlines, who served Boston, Oakland, and New York last summer, with over a 90% load factor. Plus, the FAA Category 1 rating for the country allows them to launch the new routes once approved by the DOT. Getting a bit more wild, we can look at CEIBA, the flag carrier for Equatorial Guinea. The airline previously had 767s that were used to serve Spain, considering that Equatorial Guinea is Africa's only Spanish-speaking country, although they're now banned from EU airspace. The airlines never had transatlantic flights, but they have discussed flights to the US or larger Caribbean cities. And while it sounds fun, the country is not currently FAA Category 1, which takes years to get. The airline lacks long-haul fleets at the moment, and there's less than 500 Equatorial Guineans in the US. So I don't really see this one happening. Another airline with clear-cut goals is Air Cote d'Ivoire. The West African flag carrier doesn't presently have the fleet for long-haul flights, but did order two A330neos in 2022. Those aircraft were painted and pictured in Toulouse, but the airline was seeking financing to make it in time for a 2024 delivery. When these aircraft were ordered, the airline was very clear that they were intended for the United States, with a main focus on New York. I have mixed sources that the airline used A330s to reach New York previously, but Ethiopian does have a fifth Freedom flight between Abidjan and JFK, which I took recently and was only about half full. My guess is that if Air Cote d'Ivoire launches JFK flights, there won't be enough demand for both of those, so one of the carriers would want to switch the Abidjan service to Washington, D.C. The route's shocking considering the airline's historical lack of long-haul services, especially considering how Air Senegal attempted the same thing and it only lasted a few years, and there's almost double the amount of Senegalese Americans than Ivorian Americans, both of which are highly concentrated in New York. Cote d'Ivoire is currently Category 1, and the airline has made their plans clear. Once those aircraft arrive, they will be flown to New York. But that's a big if and when. Mauritius is growing amongst the world's most common vacation spots. The island nation in the Indian Ocean has some of the best tropical scenes on the planet, and their flag carrier, Air Mauritius, is helping them to offer their own aviation services. With A350s and A330neos, Air Mauritius has a modern fleet, although the country is literally the furthest from the US by distance, being on the opposite side of the globe, so a non-stop flight wouldn't be possible. Currently, the airline flies to a number of European destinations, and they've previously toyed with the idea of New York or Los Angeles flights as a fifth Freedom route, continuing from Paris, London, or Dubai, although there haven't been any serious talks. So while it remains a fun idea, it's another one that I don't see as super likely. The Nigerian airline of Air Peace is one of the most discussed airlines that could appear in the US. Last year I made 3 videos on them covering their plans, issues, and in-flight experience, so definitely go check those out, so I don't want to echo all that all again. To summarize, however, there's more Nigerians in the US than anywhere in the world, and more than any other African country. There's about 400,000 Nigerians in the US, mostly in Houston, followed by DC and New York. Delta already flies to Lagos from New York and Atlanta, and United serves Lagos from DC, and all 3 routes have been highly profitable in load factors. In March 2024, after launching London flights, the CEO of Air Peace announced that the airline would begin service to New York and Houston by the end of the year, although still nothing from Abuja. In order to do this, they'd have to get more aircraft, which they said they already did, but it's been over a year and they still don't appear to have placed an order. Over a year ago, the Nigerian Minister of Aviation gave Air Peace approval to launch flights to New York, although it doesn't appear that they've begun the process with the US government yet. This is likely because Nigeria currently lacks FAA Category 1 ratings. They lost the certification after it went unused for multiple years, but it took them 5 years last time to get it. And Nigeria did their own internal tests to simulate the FAA test, and the analysts claimed that the country failed in multiple regards. My guess from my travels is that Nigeria is still quite a ways away from this unless they bring in outside help. And Air Peace won't apply for the U.S. foreign air carrier permit until the FAA Category 1 certification is granted. Perhaps the biggest hurdle for them is their own administration. The airline's CEO has been charged with 35 crimes by the U.S. Department of Justice, including money laundering, falsifying documents, and fraud. I discussed this at length in my Air Peace history video, but without a new leadership, I find it unlikely that Air Peace will reach the US. There's definitely a market for this, however. Nigeria is the second largest sub-Saharan aviation market behind South Africa, and they have the largest population on the continent and one of the highest GDPs. And Air Peace is the country's largest airline. So Air Peace may be launching flights, but for bonus points, there's another Nigerian carrier that actually did it. RwandAir flew to New York until 2017 before they fell into financial disarray. They lost their A340s and now just operate a few planes with only medium haul ranges, so at this point, I doubt we see a return from RwandAir. Another airline that I've covered in the past is RwandAir. I was pleasantly surprised by the Rwandan flag carrier that currently serves long-haul markets in London, Paris, and Brussels. At the moment, they have 3 A330s and plan to double their fleet in the next 5 years. That being said, the aircraft type can't reach the Americas nonstop. This hasn't stopped them from planning U.S. flights, however. The airlines opened a hub in Cote so they can serve West Africa with smaller aircraft, not needing to fly direct from Kigali, and it sounds like they'd use a similar plan for U.S. flights, using the A330 from Rwanda to either Accra or Cote and continuing on to the U.S. But would it work? There's only 10,000 Rwandan Americans, not enough for a flight, but the US does import a ton of minerals from Rwanda. And if they can get the 7th Freedom flight from Ghana or Benin, they could get some of those passengers. It seems the airlines would like US flights, but I don't see them ever making financial sense. Plus, since Qatar Airways owns 49% of RwandAir, they've been able to code-share flights through Doha between Rwanda and Qatar's 11 US destinations. South African Airways is an airline with a long history of flights to the US, but since the pandemic, they've been in a heap of financial issues that has kept them from returning. There's not only a couple 100,000 South Africans in the US, but there's a ton of tourism between the two countries. Delta and United each offer 2 routes between the two countries, serving the 2 to 3,000 daily passengers. Obviously, SAA would love to capitalize on the market, but their situation's changed. At the moment, they've only got the 2 A330s and 2 A340s, and they're entirely busy flying to Perth, Sao Paulo, and West Africa. Previously, they served DC and New York, but with A350s, which they have since offloaded to save money. They have served other routes with these older aircraft with connections in Dakar, Senegal, but unless they get some more aircraft, I'm not sure they can support that. Realistically, they will return to the US eventually, but there's no clear timeline at this point. What about Air Tanzania? I flew with them recently and had a pleasant experience. They operate 2 787s that could reach the US East Coast, but currently are seen on their China flights mostly. There's a Tanzanian diaspora in the US of roughly 50,000, and the tourism to Kilimanjaro and Zanzibar could supplement that. It's similar to Kenya Airways' flight from Nairobi to New York, which operates 10 times weekly, with a load factor of over 90%. Now, there's slightly more travel to Kenya, but I definitely see a demand for Air Tanzania. At the moment, Air Tanzania seems to be omitting the US from their plans. They've been largely focusing on China and India, plus they're working to get unbanned from EU airspace to launch flights to London. It should be noted they only have 3 787s, so if they make London work and grow the Chinese routes like they'd like, they may not have the fleet for US flights. But the country is FAA Category 1, so at this point, it's up to the airline. In 2023, when I covered Air Algerie, I also covered the flag carrier of their next door neighbor, Tunisiar. Tunisiar is a much smaller airline with only 2 A330s being flown to Montreal. They did order some A350s, but dropped the order in 2013, now looking just to lease another A330. The demand for the flight's much less than Air Algerie, and Tunisiar also has a non-existent long-haul market. There's only 15,000 Tunisian Americans, while there's more than that in the Montreal area alone. Tunisia and the US also have a teetering business tie, considering Tunisia goes back and forth between favoring the US or China and Russia. And while Montreal is the only long haul the carrier maintains at the moment, Tunisia discussed expansion plans, which included JFK flights in 2017, although they never happened. More recently, they said they plan to launch Shanghai and Beijing this year, and then New York and DC in 2028. While I'd obviously welcome the new routes with excitement, I just don't see the demand. Tunisiar doesn't have an alliance or partnership, so they'd be relying on originating passengers in New York and DC. New York to Tunis saw roughly 50 people per day, and DC with about 30, which is hardly enough to support a flight. I mean, Montreal to Tunis sees 266 people per day, and they've only been able to get 2 to 3 flights per week, and when I flew with them, the airplane was far from full. But since there's no real visa requirement for US citizens to get to Tunisia, once the country gets the Category 1 certification, a new fleet will be the only thing in their way. And then there's Uganda. The East African nation has a relatively new airline with two of the rare A330-800s. These are the longer range version of the newer A330s, long enough to reach the US East Coast from the airline's hub of Entebbe. There's only about 25,000 Ugandan Americans, but unlike most African nations, they're mostly in California and Massachusetts, neither of which are likely to see service. Atlanta maintains the highest proportion of Africans, so Uganda Airlines could target Atlanta and then connect those passengers where they need to go. But Uganda Airlines still doesn't have a great connecting network compared to other carriers. New York is a favorite for vacationers, and airlines typically see New York flights as a flashy achievement. And then there's the Washington, D.C. area, which is great for diplomatic reasons, connecting the capital cities. They did say they plan to launch US and China flights once it gets new aircraft, but it took them a while to build the airline up. So, with the newly announced London flights, they need to be careful not to go too fast, and for that reason, I doubt we see Uganda Airlines in the US anytime soon. Europe's tricky because most airlines either already serve the US or aren't going to serve the US. And while it's definitely a touchy subject, since the war, no Russian or Ukrainian airline has flown to the US. Ukraine International still exists, but has suspended operations with their fleet being stashed safely at an airport. The airline industry in the country is definitely not a worry of theirs at the moment, but when it does eventually return, the question is how much of their network gets restored. They still have 767s and 777s on paper, but with over 1 million Ukrainian Americans, there is definitely demand for them to return to the US. They even served JFK since 2014 with great profitable load factors, but suspended the route for the pandemic and continued the suspension due to the war. Unfortunately, there aren't any solid plans for the airline considering the future is so up in the air, but they did plan to launch Toronto and New York with 777s in 2022 before the war broke out. So when they're finally able to resume operations, I'd have to imagine New York is in the plans. Unfortunately, they will also have to re-up their Category 1 rating. They did hold it before the Russian invasion, but will have to prove that it's still met after the war. Good luck to all the Ukrainians out there. On the other side, will Russian airlines return? They have 6 airlines with the fleet capable of reaching the US, with Aeroflot being their main long-haul carrier. With 3 million Russian Americans, mostly in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, plus oil ties and billions of dollars of metals and chemicals traded, there's no doubt there's a demand for these routes, even with a steady decline in partnerships in the last 5 years. Currently, Cuba is the only North American nation with flights to Russia, but before the war, Aeroflot flew to 4 US cities. Transaero flew to JFK until 2015, and S7, RwandAir, and Pobeda planned New York flights but never launched them. The thing with Russian flights is that we thought the ties were severed after the invasion, but a recent cooperation between governments might change that, with Russia and the US recently in talks about resuming services. You really never know what the current administration will end up deciding, but there's no such discussions with Ukraine's airlines. If Russia does resume flights, they'll have to re-up their FAA Category 1 rating and will be relying on point-to-point passengers since their SkyTeam membership was suspended. I mean, there's more than enough demand, but would it really be? Last year, we covered HiSky, the Moldovan and Romanian leisure airline that launched the first service between the US and Romania by a Romanian carrier in over 20 years. But what about Romania's flag carrier, TAROM? After all, there's about 500,000 Romanian Americans, mostly in New York, and the Bucharest flights were previously served by Delta Airlines and TAROM themselves until the 2010s. Those two airlines reported about 70% load factors, which is surprisingly low for the size of the diaspora, which led to the cancellation of the route. Even on my HiSky flight, I saw less than half the plane full. This was largely due to Romanians still needing visas to visit the US, although this year, Romania was added to the ESTA program, which should hopefully provide a huge boost in the travel. For a little while now, TAROM has lacked the fleet to reach long-haul destinations, and it's shrinking in size. Because of this, they also have no plans to resume US flights, although they were marketing flights to Miami and New York last year, but it ended up just being a connection with ITA Airways in Rome as SkyTeam partners. So no TAROM for now, just HiSky. There's also a couple low-cost carriers that we may see with new services. Norse and Neos have found new successes in the low-cost long-haul markets. The main new ones that aren't in the US at the moment are the Spanish carriers of World2Fly and Plus Ultra. These are the two low-cost carriers with the fleet to reach the US, and both currently serve Latin America. Obviously, there's demand between Spain and cities in the East Coast, and the shorter flights are the best for the low-cost carriers since you aren't stuck with a budget product for 10 plus hours. Plus Ultra actually used to fly to New York and Miami, but opted not to return after COVID, focusing instead on South America. And World 2 Fly flew to Orlando previously, but has since suspended that as well. Neither carrier has plans to resume US flights, but the budget carrier market, especially from Florida, is booming, so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw them announce plans soon. And Air Greenland is the last European carrier that doesn't serve the US at the moment. There's definitely a sticky situation with politics on this one, but United announced they'll be launching New York to Greenland flights with a 737. There's basically no Greenland diasporas, but tourism is on the rise. The airline has the sole A330-800 that serves the Copenhagen flight daily, but using turboprops, the airline launched Canadian flights last year. Other than that, they seem to be leasing 737s for other Greenland to mainland Denmark flights, but there's no plans for Air Greenland to fly to the US, and I don't see any coming soon. Now moving to the Asian continent, we see Gulf Air, the flag carrier of Bahrain. I covered the fascinating airline on a long-haul business class flight to Thailand last year if you want to see the product, but with 10 787s, the airline is capable of reaching the US and has been trying to get there for quite some time now. There's only about 10,000 Bahrainis in the US, but there are insane business connections in the petroleum industry. There's already flights to the US from the Arabian Peninsula from Saudi, Etihad, Royal Jordanian, Emirates, and Qatar, but there's still a ton of passengers that connect to Bahrain, so a direct flight seems to have enough demand. Gulf Air did actually fly to New York previously until 2008, but now they only code share on American Airlines connections in Heathrow, Paris, and Frankfurt. They applied for US flights in 2022 and even began hiring employees for a JFK operation. Currently, they only have the approval for code sharing US flights, but last year they applied to get flight rights with their own aircraft. This should be made easier by the country receiving their Category 1 rating in November, so hopefully we'll see that Bahrain service soon, where they've shown interest in New York and Houston. Azerbaijan Airlines did serve JFK from 2009 to 2016, but was canceled for low demand. They did this route largely with A340s and have since upgraded the fleet to two 787s and 767s. With 25,000 Azeris in the US, largely in California and New York, the diaspora demand is low, and there's not a whole lot of tourism between the countries. Plus, Azerbaijan seems to have better business ties with the Eastern world at the moment. So while the country still holds FAA Category 1 status, the airline hasn't announced plans to resume US services, and I doubt they will. JFK is America's most internationally connected airport, and their highest demand route that doesn't see service at the moment is to Dhaka, Bangladesh, with over 450 passengers flying it daily, but currently connecting through the Middle East or India. The Bangladeshi flag carrier Biman Bangladesh would love to capitalize on this, providing a direct flight for the 200,000 Bangladeshi Americans and their families. The airline did previously serve JFK before the pandemic with a stop in Brussels, and currently only serves Toronto in North America with a stop in Istanbul. With 777s and 787s, it appears the airline could reach the US nonstop, although they may use the stop to avoid weight restricting the flights. The country also lacks the FAA Category 1 rating at the moment, which is proving to be the biggest hurdle. Once that's regained, it sounds like the airline has planned to relaunch the New York flights, but also floated the idea of Los Angeles flights. And if demand is there, potentially also Boston, Houston, Dallas, and DC, although likely with an intermediate stop. Just like how Nigeria had a couple of options for carriers, Bangladesh also has a low-cost airline that could launch services, known as US Bengala. At the moment, the A330 is their biggest aircraft, so US services would require a stop. They've recently been looking at long-haul flights to Europe, although it doesn't sound like US flights are on their radar at the moment. I am frequently blown away by the amount of long-haul carriers in China. If you're not familiar with the aviation structure in China, they have laws where only one Chinese carrier can offer each route. So for example, Shanghai to San Francisco is in crazy demand, but China Eastern already flies from the main Shanghai airport to San Francisco. Foreign airlines can fly this route like United's daily flight, but if another carrier wants to compete, they'd have to fly from a different airport in Shanghai or a different airport in San Francisco. As far as I can see, there are 3 Chinese airlines with the fleet for US flights, but without any current services. Junyao Airlines flies 787s with a Shanghai hub. They do have hubs in both Shanghai airports, however, so maybe they'll launch flights from Hongqiao instead of Pudong. although Hangzhou really only sees regional flights at the moment. Shanghai Airlines is the other airline, and surprise, surprise, they have a Shanghai hub as well, so it might be a race to see who launches US flights from the smaller Shanghai airport. The last is Shenzhen Airlines, found in Shenzhen. They have only A330s as their biggest aircraft, which would be stretching the range to reach the US. With the airport limitations, I'd guess that we see existing airlines operating new city pairs, although there are secondary cities in the US that are big enough to see Chinese flights. Some have before, like San Jose and Ontario. There is an unbelievable amount of Indian Americans. Air India, American, and United see great load factors on their routes between the US and India, but the low-cost carrier IndiGo has a growing fleet of wide-bodies now. Their Boeing wide-bodies can reach the US, although they pack them in such a high-density configuration that might limit it. It would definitely lack the required comforts on the 15-plus hour flights, but we could see fares at an all-time low, which will no doubt bring them a customer base. They're just now experimenting with European routes, so my guess is they won't look into the US until they see success in Europe. In the meantime, they can continue code sharing on Turkish Airlines flights in Istanbul. They are still aided by the Russian airspace restrictions since US carriers can't operate there, limiting the destinations they can reach. It's why Air India flies to San Francisco from Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore, and United has had to cancel their plans to take over those routes. So, do you think we'll see the Indian low-cost carrier stateside? Personally, I do, but it'll take a while. Back in 2023, I flew Garuda Indonesia's first class to Amsterdam, and it was an incredible flight. Indonesia is one of the most populated countries in the world, and there's roughly 150,000 Indonesian Americans, split mostly between Los Angeles and San Francisco. So will the airline launch US flights? They did previously serve Los Angeles via Honolulu, and even with their 777s that they have now, they wouldn't be able to make the direct flight. Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand have been wanting to add new US flights, although Garuda hasn't mentioned any plans just yet, currently only code sharing on flights through Singapore. Garuda is one of the only carriers on this list in one of the big three alliances, and with their SkyTeam partnership, I could see them launching Los Angeles or New York flights as Delta hubs, although likely through Tokyo than anything else. I've had interest in Iraqi Airways for a long time. They actually maintain one of the youngest fleets in Western Asia, using two 787s for long-haul flights. With about 200,000 Iraqi Americans and major oil ties, the demand is more than strong enough. It's just tough with the politics of it all. The US says they maintain a strategic partnership with Iraq, but the relationship still feels hostile, at least between the governments, as the people are some of the kindest people I've ever met, and the country's one of the most beautiful. At the moment, the FAA has restrictions on flights to and even over the country, so they can't even code share flights. But Royal Jordanian, Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi sell connecting flights to Iraq more than any other country in the region. Once the airline got their 787s, they began planning long-haul flights, and New York, Chicago, DC, and Detroit were in the plans as cities that could easily fill a 787 to Iraq. I, unfortunately, think that we won't see Iraqi Airways in the US for a while. But once they do show up, I'll be there. Hanging out in the same region, what about the Lebanese airline Middle East Airlines? They operate A330s that could reach the US to serve the over 2 million Lebanese Americans and additional connections to unserved Middle East countries. There isn't as much business between the countries, but the diaspora demand is there. Plus, it serves as an entry point for both Lebanon and Syria, adding an extra few 100,000 people to the demand. A while back, MEA flew to the US but suspended flights due to security reasons, and the country maintains the Category 1 rating. And they are a SkyTeam member, so Detroit would actually make the most sense in my mind. They haven't mentioned any US plans, likely because of the cost to launch and operate the route, but it seems worth it on paper at least, so I wonder if we'll see Middle East Airlines in the US soon. Malaysia is another country that has plenty long-haul flights, but none to the US. With the major markets in Singapore, Malaysian carriers have been wary of US flights. There are about 40,000 Malaysian Americans and lots of business between the two countries. Malaysia Airlines does have 7 A350s that could reach the US and previously served the US with their older fleet. Using the old 777s, they flew from KL to Los Angeles through Tokyo with a roughly 80% load factor, which is profitable, but was ultimately suspended in 2014. The country did lose their Category 1 rating but got it back in 2022, and with their One World partnership, you'd have to think that a Los Angeles flight would be profitable if they can launch nonstop flights with the A350s. With New York losing American flights to Philly, I do wonder if that would still be a target of theirs, but even still, however, they haven't named any official plans for US flights. But Southeast Asia demand definitely exists for diasporas and vacationers. That's why I've also looked at AirAsia X, the low-cost carrier for Malaysia. At the moment, with A330s, they couldn't reach the US nonstop. The airline once partnered with the Oakland Raiders, but US flights never actually materialized. I see a fairly likely chance that Malaysia Airlines returns to the US, but essentially 0% chance of AirAsia X without the A340s. United shocked the world when they announced a flight from Tokyo to Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, launching in May 2025. This is a way to connect the US with Mongolia with a 737 in case the demand isn't high enough for a plane big enough for nonstop. MIAT Mongolian Airlines is the country's largest carrier, and a couple years ago they got 787s specifically to fly to the US. At this point, they have two, with one parked. While they wait for certifications, there's only 50,000 Mongolian Americans, with most in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but they have a busy consulate in San Francisco, so the airline has been clear that they intend to launch flights from Ulaanbaatar to San Francisco as soon as they get the FAA Category 1 certification. Their only long haul at the moment is to Istanbul and Frankfurt, which they've used the 787s on, but they've been code sharing on flights to the US, with Cathay's San Francisco flight being one of the most common code shared flights. So it's only a matter of time until we see MIAT. Just seems that we're working at the speed of the US government at this point. Pakistan International Airlines has 777s that they use to reach the countries with larger Pakistani diasporas, and the US has over 500,000 PAX. In the past, PIA served JFK from Lahore, but it was dropped in 2017. Since then, they've been banned from EU airspace, and their biggest long-haul route was their Toronto flights from Lahore, Islamabad, and Karachi. Last year, they were unbanned from EU airspace and announced Paris flights, somewhat infamously. And in December, PIA announced official plans for UK and US flights, including 4 times weekly JFK flights and twice weekly Chicago flights. The main hurdle remains that FAA Category 1 certification, although the Pakistani authorities seem fairly confident that they are about to be upgraded to Category 1. The biggest question mark in the continent is RiyadhAir. They will have 787s that could reach the US from Saudi Arabia, and considering that the US and Saudi are major business partners, I'd see it as a likely option, especially since Saudia flies from Jeddah and Riyadh to New York, DC, and Los Angeles. But it sounds like Saudia will step back from Riyadh a bit once RiyadhAir launches. The main structure will be a major hub and spoke system based in Riyadh like the other Gulf carriers do, but they haven't actually announced a route structure yet. They did sign a strategic partnership with Delta, however, so JFK is looking more and more likely as one of their first targets. And then Thailand is one of the biggest countries for US vacationers, yet it lacks nonstop flights at the moment. The East Asian nation used to serve LAX and JFK with the inefficient A340-500, but dropped those flights for financial issues. They've refreshed the fleet and now have 53 wide-bodies, 777s, 787s, and A350s that could reach the US, with more on order, and the extra efficiency should make the routes profitable. The biggest issue with Thailand flights is that they are so leisure-heavy that airlines need business class demand to make a profit, and they don't really think they can get it on these routes. It's why United finally launched Bangkok flights, but from Hong Kong to test the market. If that United route sells enough premium seats, they may look for direct services to the US, but it also could be the trigger for Thai Airways to resume their flights. They were downgraded to FAA Category 2 about 10 years ago, but the FAA says they expect the country to be upgraded this year. So I'd expect that we see Thai Airways announce services soon after that. Los Angeles and New York would presumably be the top targets for the tourism markets, or San Francisco for the Star Alliance connection. There's less options in Oceania, but Virgin Australia used to be one of the big players. Flying long haul for about 10 years until COVID, the Virgin Airline Down Under served Los Angeles with their 777s from Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne, and LA remained their only truly successful route. That being said, it sounds like Virgin Australia is planning a return to long haul flying. They announced a resumption of long haul flights in June 2025 to Doha due to the Qatar Airways investment of 25% in the airline. The codeshare with United Airlines makes me think they'll look into San Francisco or Los Angeles if they expand any more than Doha. But I do wonder if they'll overcome the issue that previously shut down the long-haul operations, other than COVID. They were outperformed by competitors on all their routes. The US return is dependent on the Doha flights performing, but would be a risky venture for the company for sure. There's a bunch of small airlines in the Pacific Islands, similar to the Caribbean, and I'm sure the overseas territories of the US will see additional services, but the only airline I see potentially reaching the 50 states is Nauru Airlines. The world's third smallest country by size and population has an airline to connect with the rest of the Polynesian world. They have a number of Fifth Freedom routes to places like Kiribati and Majuro, but I see Honolulu as a legit potential for them. The airline did serve Guam and Honolulu previously with 737s, and I could see them looking to return, giving the small country of Nauru a connection to trade outside of New Zealand and Australia. The Americas are similar to Europe in that most of the airlines are either already flying to the US or never will. So it's basically just the sanctioned airlines and countries. First up is Cubana. The airline kinda has the fleet to reach the US since anything will work, but they've been having issues keeping the fleet operational at one time. I currently only see one plane active and it appears to have flown to Russia in late March. Their flights to Spain appear to be with leased aircraft and the rest appear to be parked or just don't show any flights in the last month. With 2.5 million Cuban Americans, the demand seems to be there. The airline just has some operational issues. They did fly to New York in the 60s, but that's about it because of the country's history until recent. Now, American, United, Delta, and Southwest each fly to Cuba with roughly 70% load factors, and if Cubana could operate the routes, I'd have to imagine that we'd see them in New York and Miami at least. And lastly, Conviasa. The Venezuelan airline has been at the top of my wish list for a while. They've got plenty of aircraft that can reach the US and serve the nearly 1 million Venezuelan Americans, but there's the aviation side and the political side, and neither can operate without the other. There's still significant business ties, mostly oil related, but it's nearly impossible to travel between the two countries right now, with visas being a challenge and a half for both sides. Venezuela definitely used to have flights. United, American, and Delta all served Caracas. United pulled out in 2017 because only oil execs from Houston were flying and it wasn't filling flights. Delta pulled out that same year, quoting currency disputes with the country, and then American pulled out in 2019 over safety concerns and having to write off almost $600 million in debts that the country never paid back. And other countries' carriers were doing and saying the same. Typically, this would open the market wide open for Conviasa to launch their own flights, but the airline was sanctioned by the US as part of sanctions on the country as a whole. Sanctions on the airline were partially lifted in 2023, but the CEO was sanctioned this year, so it was kind of one step forward, one step back. So while I'm sure they love US flights, the airline hasn't announced any plans as they would seem kind of futile. But they seem content with what they operate at the moment amid the tricky political situation. From coast to coast, there's exciting potential as the aviation markets have been booming in ways we've never seen before since COVID, and it's been exciting to see new routes and airlines taking advantage of this. I left a couple out to keep the video from getting too long, but that doesn't mean they're not appreciated. But what do you see as a future route that would make sense to the US? Let me know below, and until next Sunday, safe travels. I'll see y'all next time.